improved anxiety. We're going to talk about anxiety today because it fits under the paranoia. Okay, this is take number 3 of this video, because if the first take, I actually broke the camera. You saw some of that in the last episode. I was having trouble with my camera. I got a new one. It's a nice camera. It's almost too nice because it records in 4K. So the files are really gigantic. And so take 1, I broke the camera. People joke about breaking the camera. I actually break cameras. But then take 2, I got it up on the live stream. And I really appreciate you people that watched it on live stream, even though I had to delete the video and lose all those views because it was too choppy. I clearly haven't got it quite figured out. I'm hoping to live stream in the future. Just makes my life easier, makes it more fun. But with a DSLR camera, a high quality camera, it's actually more complicated than I thought to do a live stream. You have to have this video encoder and all these extra things. So complicated. I'm glad you're here. Let's talk about paranoia and cannabis. So when I was just out in California, I was with Mark Bell and I was driving between Sacramento and San Francisco. And I thought, man, they're doing a lot of controlled burns. Look at all the smoke coming over the highway. Turns out it was one of the worst wildfires in history, maybe the worst, I don't know. And it was pretty intense. When I got to San Francisco, I went to one of these cannabis shops, and it was a really cool experience. CBD, full spectrum CBD, I'm really impressed with. I know people that have had hemorrhoids for like a decade, and they take that stuff for a day, and it clears right up. Try the snap again. So CBD, I'm really impressed. If you've got inflammatory issues, you should definitely try it. And I'll list a few other things, a long list of things that you might want to consider in the context of CBD. They also had a lot of THC products at this store. Like I said, it was a really interesting experience. Most of them, they just have THC, 10 milligrams THC, whatever, in these gummies or in these, whatever products. But they don't have any CBD, and that's something you should watch for. Watch and make sure you're getting the CBD because that's where most of the benefits are. But first, before I even talk about paranoia, before I talk about other benefits of CBD, I want to show you this news article that just came out. It's in the Washington Post, and it's called, the title is, NASA to launch a safety review of SpaceX after video of Elon Musk smoking pot rankled agency leaders. It's amazing, right? I mean, these days, if people disagree with you, rather than having a discussion, a debate, thoughtful conversation, they go after you. They do a safety review. This is our government money. A months-long assessment that involves hundreds of interviews designed to evaluate the culture. That's what NASA is doing because why? The review is prompted by recent behavior of SpaceX's founder Elon Musk. What was he doing? Something perfectly legal, not even excessive. He took a hit of marijuana on a podcast streamed on the internet that rankled some of NASA's highest levels. Which podcast? Joe Rogan, of course. I can't even do an episode on cannabis without bringing up Joe Rogan. So, again, this is a big issue. What's really ironic about NASA attacking Elon Musk in this underhanded way is, and I think it's unethical, frankly, but what's ironic is the government itself just came out with a report. It's from the National Academy of Sciences. I think it was 2017, almost positive, but it's called The Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids, the Current State of Evidence and Recommendations. Over 100 pages, huge peer-reviewed journal, huge author, not the journal, huge list of peer reviewers, huge list of authors. Tons of people are involved in this, putting together this report, the current state of research, of evidence. And what they did, they nicely organized it into areas where there's conclusive evidence about cannabis and cannabinoids being effective, where there's moderate evidence, and then where there's limited evidence. So they had 3 categories. Let's start with conclusive, substantial evidence. I shouldn't say, they said there's conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective. Boom, treatment of chronic pain in adults. Substantial evidence for that. What else? Treatment of chemotherapy-induced nausea. Okay. MS, spasticity, multiple sclerosis, spasticity. If you got that, worth a try. It's not going to hurt you. There is moderate evidence for improved short-term sleep. There's limited evidence for increasing appetite, which is hilarious because almost everybody who smokes cannabis, smokes marijuana, smokes weed, has increased appetite. And they say, oh, there's only limited evidence for that. Again, what they want to see is thousands of papers. But anyways, they talk about limited evidence. There's increased appetite, improved symptoms of Tourette syndrome, improved anxiety symptoms, improved anxiety. We're going to talk about anxiety today because it fits under the paranoia that we're going to go into. Improving PTSD, limited evidence for better outcomes after traumatic brain injury. So these are a lot of inflammatory related things. Limited evidence for decreased risk of diabetes, but increased risk of prediabetes. Why? Increased appetite. They're doing these giant epidemiology studies where they're lumping all kinds of people together and people that have bad habits, and they're putting them together with people that have good habits. It's muddy research, epidemiology, but increased risk of diabetes, decreased risk of diabetes. Substantial evidence for worse respiratory symptoms if you're long-term cannabis smoker, but improved airway dynamics with acute use. So in other words, just from the CBD or just from temporary smoking, you actually get improvements in your lungs. Higher forced vital capacity, for example, is another example of that. Limited evidence, but there's a decrease in production of several anti-inflammatory cytokines. Those are the compounds that go throughout your blood and cause inflammation. They can oftentimes just be systemic, like just in your joints or just in your brain or something, and nobody's testing for them because you're not going to take a piece of your brain and measure how much inflammatory cytokines. But if you're doing these research studies, you can prove that these CBD decreases these inflammatory chemicals, so it's anti-inflammatory. On and on, right? Literally hundreds of pages. I just printed off a few of the key ones. Moderate evidence for impairment in cognitive domains of learning and attention in acute cannabis use. How hilarious is it? In other words, when you're high, you're not going to be learning something. You're going to have attention or memory impairments. Of course you are. That's not really a negative thing. Similar with alcohol, right? It doesn't mean you're having long-term brain damage, which some people like to kind of extrapolate and say. Here's one. There's substantial evidence for a statistical association between cannabis use and development of schizophrenia. Again, we talked about that. I did a whole episode on that in the last episode because I think it's a lot of mathematical manipulation. I don't think the evidence is really that strong. In fact, it's almost turning the tables because you're finding people that have schizophrenia are using CBD in a successful way when it's related to neuroinflammation, when it's related to brain inflammation. Again, whole episode on that. But let's talk about paranoia. So I think it's ridiculous that NASA is going after Elon Musk like something a mafia would do in a legalized, shakedown. But let's talk paranoia, because here I have the medical definition of psychosis, which is usually how if scientists find paranoia, they usually call it psychosis in the context of cannabis because it sounds really negative. If you're smoking weed, they don't want to say, oh, you're paranoid. They want to say, oh, you're psychotic. Here's the medical definition from medicinenet.com. Psychosis is a mental illness markedly interfering with a person's capacity to meet life's everyday demands. So if you can't keep up with your schedule, you've got psychosis. You can't meet your life's everyday demands, you're underwater a little bit, you've got psychosis. Well, let's go on. In a specific sense, it refers to thought disorder in which reality testing is grossly impaired. Again, pretty fuzzy, pretty fluffy, hard to exactly know what that means. Symptoms, so they define it based on symptoms more commonly, include seeing, hearing, smelling, or tasting things that are not there. Paranoia, or delusional thoughts. Okay, so it's paranoia specifically mentioned here. Symptoms can be constant or they may come and go. So in other words, if you're smoking weed, you get paranoia. It doesn't even have to be constant. It may come and go. You might have temporary paranoia from smoking marijuana. Boom, you're defined as psychotic. So again, that's the problem with a lot of psychiatry. Not all of it, but a lot of it is based on questionnaires. How do you feel? What do you think? It's not based on your blood test, not based on actual biological parameters. It's hard because I'm not saying these people are dishonest, it's difficult, it's difficult to test these things, but there's ways to do it. There's MRIs, there's all kinds of imaging, but most of the time it's just questionnaires. Let's look at this paper, 2016, an example of, how your genetics disposes you to paranoia. 2016, Translational Psychiatry Journal. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think this is the strongest evidence for what might happen if you smoke marijuana genetically. How do your genes dictate your response to cannabis? The paper is called AKT1. That's the gene. If you've got 23andMe and you want to search your AKT1 gene, that's the one you should check. AKT1 gene moderates the acute psychotomimetic effects. How much do you have psychosis? Acute, remember, it's temporary. Temporary psychotic effects of naturalistically smoked cannabis. So they're not vaping, they're not taking gummies, they're smoking natural cannabis in young cannabis users or young cannabis smokers. Young, emphasize young. Again, because estrogen. Watch the episode or listen to the episode on estrogen. It was just a few episodes ago, and how cannabis smoke acts like estrogen. So it impacts these young people, these teenagers, a lot more. It's a big hazard for teenagers. That's a different story than adults. Totally different. Smoking cannabis daily, they introduce this article, doubles an individual's risk of developing a psychotic disorder. Remember, that can be a passing paranoia. That's a psychotic disorder. Yet indicators of specific vulnerability have been elusive. They talk about an initial study that suggested COMT gene polymorphism, like a certain SNP, a certain variant in your COMT gene mediates this paranoia or psychosis. But subsequent large-scale studies failed to replicate that finding. So they looked at COMT. They thought that's the gene that causes different outcomes in people in response to cannabis. They found that doesn't really hold true when you repeat the study. AKT, on the other hand, does hold true. AKT1. They looked at 442 young cannabis users while intoxicated. And then they looked at them 7 days after when they were drug-free for 7 days. And AKT1 gene predicted acute psychotic response. AKT1 predicted the paranoia, basically. That's really what's going on. These findings, they say, are the first to demonstrate AKT1 mediates the acute response to cannabis. And that's what I find when I'm doing DNA consulting. I actually find this holds true. If you've got a specific version, the bad version of this AKT1 gene, you get a lot of paranoia. Oftentimes there's discussions on the Joe Rogan podcast about paranoia, and Joe Rogan tends to say that if you get a lot of paranoia from cannabis, it's internal turmoil. You're generating it yourself. You're not controlling your emotions, and you don't have a good grasp on your mental state. Maybe you're not in an optimal mental state, something like that. But boom, here it is. It's genetic. So people that have a bad version of this AKT1 gene, they have a lot of paranoia, and they don't feel that great when they smoke cannabis. They usually avoid it, but you can check your gene, see in advance if that's going to be an issue for you. It usually holds true. And, that's really the story of the genetic variation between different people and their response to cannabis. In the next episode, we'll talk about epigenetics and gateway drugs, which also was brought up in the Joe Rogan podcast with somebody named Kyle Kalinske, I think. And I want to address that because that's probably the most concerning issue with cannabis in my mind. That's some actual valid issue that people need to be concerned about besides the estrogen effects from smoking. Stay tuned in the next episode.